I am so excited that we are into season 3 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. When I first began this podcast, I had no idea that it would take off. I began it because I genuinely want more people to listen, reflect, and learn about how our life experiences can influence us in ways that we cannot begin to imagine. Due to the wonderful candid stories my speakers have shared, I now know that my podcast is ranked in the top 5% globally. I want to thank all my speakers for this huge achievement. As always, if you enjoy it, please do share, rate, and review. Thank you for listening. Today's interview is with Seamus Beirne. Seamus Beirne is 29 years old, or as he reminds me, he's 30 next month. He lives in Oslo with his boyfriend, and he works as a data analyst for a grocery delivery company. Thank you, Seamus, for joining me to share your stories of unconscious bias.
Thanks for having me.
So, just to begin with, as you know, we're exploring unconscious bias. So, what do you understand by the words unconscious bias?
So my understanding is it's about when we have a prejudice or a preconceived idea about how someone is going to behave or how something is going to be based on past experience, which is not necessarily true. So you're kind of bringing stuff or prejudices from past experiences into the present, which might actually not kind of be the case.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly one absolutely brilliant example of how we get unconscious biases. And the purpose of our conversation today was really to explore personal stories, perhaps stories that have happened to you and stories that have happened to me that have impacted on our unconscious biases. And I thought I might just share a story with you, which is now quite an old story, really. So my eldest son, who was then around, I think perhaps 19 or 20 years old, so he had this very good friend, Ben. And my son and Ben, we knew Ben very well. Ben would visit home, and we knew him so well that he'd even spent Christmas Day with us on one occasion. So fast forward a few years of my relationship with Ben, because it was contextual and because we were having a conversation about something to do with sexuality, my son happened to say to me that Ben is gay. So I then looked at him and said, "Huh? How come you've never told me before that Ben is gay?" And I still remember the withering look in his eyes when he raised his eyebrows and looked at me and said, "Why is that relevant?" And I thought to myself, of course it's not relevant. If my son were gay, then it was extremely relevant because I'd like to know who he's dating. But my son is heterosexual. And so why does it matter what the sexuality of his friend is? And that made me realize that I had often unconsciously defined people by their difference just for the sake of it. So when you hear a story like that, Seamus, what kind of stories come to your mind?
Yeah, that is a funny one around, I suppose there's a generational difference between how like my generation have grown up and our kind of associations with being gay, and then maybe your generation and my parents' generation. And it is kind of a funny thing because obviously I've got lots of gay friends, most of whom are, out to their family, and their family know that they're gay. But it is sometimes a conversation that we have around, should there be a need to kind of have a formal conversation with your parents at some point in your life, to sit them down and say, by the way, I'm gay. And a lot of times people tend to delay it until they actually have a serious partner. And I think probably the reason for that is that when you have a serious partner, there's a good excuse to tell your parents, that you're in a serious relationship, you're maybe living with them, or you're going out and that kind of thing. But before that point, it's almost an awkward thing of these, telling your parents who you prefer to sleep with, basically, is essentially what you're telling them when you're telling them that you're gay, which obviously would never be expected of straight people. Straight people wouldn't have to sit down with their parents and say, oh, by the way, mum, I really like girls who have, I don't know, some specific physical characteristic that you find sexually attractive. And so there is kind of a thing of, obviously we should all be open with our parents and tell our parents our sexuality, but at the same time, until you are in a serious relationship, is there really a need, and should we place such a big emphasis on that question?
That's an interesting point that you're making there, because from your perspective, so you've already shared with us that you are living with your boyfriend, but did you come out to your parents before you started living with your boyfriend? Or was it a more natural, organic conversation that you had with your parents? Or was it only more recently when you had a boyfriend?
Well, actually, it's a funny you should bring that up because, um, well, as we know, you are my aunt, so my uncle by blood is your husband, Seamus. We share a name, just to avoid confusion. So there's Big Seamus, my uncle, and then there's me, Little Seamus. It was actually Seamus who said to my mum, I remember, I think I was about 18. He said, has because Seamus knew that I was gay. I think it was quite obvious. And Seamus said to my mum, has Seamus come out yet? Or, have you spoken about that? And we hadn't, but it was that thing of, I was comfortable. My friends knew I was gay. We went to gay clubs and that kind of thing. I was in college at this stage. I just didn't feel the need to tell my parents. But it was something that at the same time was a bit weighing on my mind of, I should probably tell them, just for when you're having conversations about anything, it's nice for them to have that kind of context. But it was just the awkwardness of having to raise the topic, and then not knowing necessarily what their reaction would be. I mean, I suppose thinking back, it's quite clear that they would have had a positive reaction. But before you actually say it, you don't really know what they're going to say. So my mum then said to me, I was talking to Seamus, and he was asking about you, and I can't remember how it was, but she kind of just blurted it out and said, "Are you gay?" And I said, "Yeah." And then she got emotional and was crying. But for me, it was actually, that was great. And it's very common amongst gay people when you're talking about, when you make friends and that kind of thing, you eventually will come on to the topic of, how did you come out? How did you find that? All that sort of stuff. And for me, it's always a great one that I can say, oh, well, I didn't have to. My mum asked me, and then I could just say, yeah. And then she passed the message on to the family. And then, a couple of days later, my dad said, oh, your mother told me you're gay. We kind of knew since you were 3. But, great that you're, open about it and you're comfortable, and, we love you anyway, no matter what you are, kind of thing.
That's great, and that's a wonderful story. And I'm glad to know that your uncle kind of maneuvered that particular conversation for you. But in your early years and growing up, even before that conversation happened with your mother, because of your own sexuality, you were obviously aware of your own sexuality. Do you feel that your narrative, your experiences, have created any kind of unconscious biases that you have now become conscious of as you have grown older and wiser?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, I think I sort of touched on it a little bit in what I was just telling you about coming out, of the thing of, what will your parents think? And that is, I suppose, an unconscious bias in itself, of you're kind of assigning a certain potential view that your parents might have about something before you really know. And the same happens with, friends or your peers, or that sort of thing. And I do remember I was very lucky to have a great teacher actually in school who, um, in the Irish educational system, there's nothing in the curriculum about teaching people about homosexuality or discussing that really. Especially as well because I went to a school that would have had a Catholic ethos, so they probably, I don't know how the school would have felt about having that officially written down. And it's kind of interesting actually. A couple of my friends now have a charity called Shout Out, where they go around to schools and they basically go in and just say, basically gay people are a thing. There's nothing wrong with it. We're all gay. There are probably gay people in this class, and sort of just teaching them about that. I've done it myself, gone out to schools when I was in college to go into kind of 15, 16-year-olds and just talk to them about this kind of stuff. But when I was in school, I had a great teacher when we were in fifth year, which is about when you're 16 or 17. Just one class. He was actually an English teacher, and just one class. He kind of, I can't remember if it was. I don't think it was really planned or anything. It wasn't that we had a special class, but it was almost like a teacher was sick. He came into the class and was just sitting there with us, and we didn't really have much to do. And he kind of said, basically what I just described. He said, some of you will be gay, and that's totally fine. There's lots of gay. I have gay friends. There's nothing wrong with being gay, basically, and had a discussion in the class about that. And I remember it as being a moment of kind of realization, because I hadn't really, at that stage, I hadn't come out to people in school. And it was great in this context then that everybody was overwhelmingly positive about it. They all came and said, well, yeah, of course. Like we wouldn't, if someone in this class came out and told us they were gay, that wouldn't be a problem. But that was a real moment for me of realizing that that was the case, because I didn't know that. And actually part of what we spoke about in the class and part of what the teacher brought up was that, it's very common, for example, to use, or maybe not anymore, but when I was growing up, it was common to use gay as almost something is gay if it's bad or if it's kind of a bit girly or ridiculous. And he was kind of saying, you shouldn't say that because it can be taken up the wrong way. Or you shouldn't call people a faggot, for example, because even though you might just think it's a funny word, actually it could be really hurtful for gay people. And I remember people in the class saying, kind of, yeah, actually that's a good point, because even though I do call people that, I don't have a problem with anybody being gay. And to me, I had internalized those words that people were saying and calling each other, and kind of thought, oh, well, I better not come out because obviously they're using these words. They can't be very pro-gay. And then having that open discussion that the teacher initiated made me realize that actually no one really minded, and that was fine. And then I kind of shortly then came out after, or it didn't ever really came out, but just was less worried about it and didn't kind of try and hide it from people, if you know what I mean.
That's an extremely powerful story, and thank you so much for sharing that. And a big shout out, thank you to your teacher in the school when you were in the fifth year. I think you said you were age 15. What was also interesting when you were sharing this very powerful and moving story is, would you say it was when you heard him talk about that in the classroom that you even acknowledged that to yourself? Or had you already acknowledged to yourself that you were gay?
No, I definitely acknowledged it. So I think, and actually, this is part of, so that charity shout out that, is now going around Ireland and basically doing the job of what the curriculum should be doing until they change the curriculum to actually teach people about homosexuality. Um, they say that the kind of average age that people realize their sexuality is 12, and the average age that people come out, I mean, this is potentially outdated now, but it is 16. So there's a 4-year gap where you're gay, but you haven't told anyone yet. So I definitely knew before that, and I probably was out to certain people. I had friends that we'd go to like gay bars and so, even though I was actually 17 at the time, even though I shouldn't have been in the bars, but I was. Um, so yeah, no, I definitely knew. I just had made a conscious decision to not share it with people in school because of what I thought that they would think, or that how they would think about me. Whereas then this kind of discussion that the teacher initiated changed that, because actually it gave a forum for people in the class to express that actually they didn't have a problem with gay people, and that it would be fine if there was someone in the class who was gay.
That's absolutely brilliant. And you are so right about my sons went to school in this country, in London. And in London, too, the playground had the word, oh, you're so gay, as a derogatory term. And I remember having conversations when they came home. This was when they were in primary school. So, coming up to the age of 11, 12, and perhaps even in secondary school. And I would point out to them that this is not an appropriate way of talking. But so when you look back on these experiences you've had, and the confidence you have in yourself, first because of that wonderful teacher, and then thanks to your uncle and the support of your parents, um, to not really have any issues, if you like, about your sexuality. You have friends, you have family, and that's who you are. So how do you think you would have, you essentially didn't even realize that you might have had this bias. So it was unconscious that you were worried that people thought negatively of you. Then you became conscious of it and you recognize that actually it's okay and I can come out. So what would you say to anyone listening in terms of giving them the confidence to try and challenge these biases if they have them?
Yeah, so well, I think the most important thing is to just have a discussion. So to get it out in the open and to ask people what they actually think or how they are feeling about something. Because if you just are going on assumptions because you're scared that they think a certain way, well, if they do think that way, and if you ask them about it, then well, that's that. They do, and the worst thing has come true. But you already thought that that was true. But then the upside is, well, maybe they don't. So I think having an open discussion about these things is always the best policy. And even though, like you say, even though now I'm obviously living with my boyfriend, you know, I'm in a, obviously all of my family knows, all of my friends know. There still is an aspect of always having to come out, basically, because the status quo is that you're straight. And therefore in work and that kind of thing, there's always a bit of friction there when you meet someone new, who doesn't know, and you then have to tell, not that you have to tell them, but you will end up telling them that, at the weekend, what did you do? Oh, well, I was with my boyfriend or whatever. And there's always going to be that, well, what are they going to think about that? And it's never really it's not a problem, I suppose, in the context of, people, British people or Irish people nowadays, or anything like that. And actually, this is then another thing that comes into the whole unconscious bias, particularly around being gay, is that with people from maybe countries where it's not acceptable to be gay, do you then, I definitely do, assign them I'm maybe a little bit more worried, for example, in work, if I had a colleague who was from somewhere where it's not acceptable to be gay, to tell them about, what I did over the weekend with my boyfriend, because I'm maybe a little bit more worried about what they might think.
That's interesting. So in some ways, there's a bit of an unconscious bias playing up because you're trying to protect yourself. Because the point of unconscious bias is that we don't want to feel in any way unsafe, or somebody's getting accusatory, or someone is feeling negatively or thinking negatively or speaking negatively about us. So instead, we try and avoid that situation, which is what you're saying you do, and you just protect yourself and you don't even bring it up, which in itself is an interesting tool, because here again, however confident and comfortable you are in your identity, you still try to keep safe within that identity. Is that correct?
Yeah, totally. So as an example, and it's, relevant to you, I remember I had to do work over in India, in Bangalore. So I went over there twice, for, quite a while, like a week or two at a time. I was helping training some teams out there who were working on a project that we were doing in work. And I never came out to them, the people in the office in Bangalore, because I didn't know what they would think. Because I potentially it's changed now, but and potentially now homosexuality is have they just legalized it? There was something in the press recently that I was reading about homosexuality and the law in India anyway. But I never came out to my Indian colleagues because I didn't know what their reaction would be. But potentially they would have been totally fine with it. But I've never found that out. Because of what my preconceived notions of what their attitude to gay people would be.
Fair enough. Good point. And in answer to your question, yes, it is legalized in India now. And I suspect many of your colleagues would have been totally fine with it. And some of your colleagues may not have been fine with it. But that's the case in probably in the United Kingdom and in Ireland, depending on the generation, depending on their outlook, depending on their narrative. So that's really good to know that you once again were thinking, I need to protect myself. So perhaps what I will not do is come out. So I suppose what you're really saying is, in terms of identity and sexuality, it is important to scan the environment, to go with your own instinct of what the outcome might be, and then make a decision on whether it's the right thing or not to come out. That's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, it's that. And then I suppose there's a second thing, which is maybe, in these cases, it is an unconscious bias in that in the split second that they ask me, do you live with anyone or do you have a girlfriend? I would just say no. And that is obviously something unconscious where it's not that I have, before I've gone to India, sat down and thought, right, when they ask me about my partner, make sure to not tell. I didn't think it through that much. It was just in the moment, in the split second, I thought, oh, actually, I don't know what they're going to think. So I'll just say, oh no, I just live on my own, or I live with friends, or something like that. Um, but then I suppose the second thing about unconscious bias is it's just a shortcut, right? It's that rather than having to think through when you're meeting every single person, thinking through, right, okay, how am I going to deal with this person? Da 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 da. It's probably almost an evolutionary kind of response or kind of system that our brain has of, okay, right, categorize these people into here so that when you meet them, you know how to deal with them, and you don't have to, every time you meet a new person, go and consciously think about how you should deal with them. And actually, I've just started reading Thinking Fast and Slow. I don't know if you know that book, but it's talking about this. So there's two modes of thinking. One is this split second kind of um, response where probably the unconscious bias can come through. And then the second one is the more considered thinking approach. And its point is you don't have time to always do the considered thinking approach. So you have to take a shortcut sometimes and just have the unconscious bias.
Absolutely. In fact, you took the words out of my mouth because I was going to ask you, have you read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow?
Yeah.
And you said it to me instead. And in fact, in that book, he says that we have what, simply put, is the front brain, which is the new neocortex brain, and then the amygdala or the back brain, which is the reptilian brain. And the reptilian brain is our fast brain. And of course, our new neocortex brain is our slow brain. And it's not that you plan, but you arrived in India, somebody asked you a question, and your reptilian brain, the one that keeps you safe, the one that protects you, just instinctively reacted and you said what you did. And that's what's the power of our brain, and how our brain instinctively, without us even realizing, can influence us unconsciously into saying something or having an opinion about X, Y, or Z. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, Seamus, and I really appreciate your time in talking about your journey, your experiences, your narrative um, about your own identity as a young 28-year-old gay man living in London at the moment. Any last top tips that you might like to add for our listeners?
I suppose what when you were just talking there about the the response that I had to my Indian colleagues, and that I didn't tell them that I was gay, is that I suppose part of the harm that potentially that unconscious bias does in relation to specifically the topic that we're talking about is that if my reptilian brain, as we call it, is is protecting me and not allowing me to kind of be open with colleagues and that kind of thing about that. It's that then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Is that if we don't ever challenge the status quo and stand up and say, oh, well, actually, I'm different because we're worried that other people are going to think badly of us, then nothing will ever change, right? We'll just continue the way that we are, and no one will kind of ever break the mold, I suppose. Is so maybe next time you and it's kind of actually given me pause for thought because I hadn't really properly thought about it. But maybe next time, if I think, right, is this person going to think negatively of me? Maybe I should give them the benefit of the doubt and tell them and see what their response is, as opposed to just assuming the worst of them and then kind of never kind of pushing the boat out, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense, and I'm thank you for that brave insight, because it is something that we should all do. It's not just you alone. We all have different unconscious biases, and it is about challenging the status quo. It is about challenging our own instinctive reaction. It is about reflection based on our previous experiences. As you said, you were in India, so maybe if you are next in India, would you do things differently? I suspect you would, and that's been a wonderful outcome alone from this conversation. Seamus Beirne, all the very best, and thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, do tune in every Saturday for a new interview. And if you could share, leave a review and rating, that would be hugely appreciated. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter @Smita Tharoor, and feel free to suggest new guests. Until next week.